Numinous Podcast with Carmen Spaniola.
Hi there, and welcome to the Numinous Podcast, where we have interesting conversations with everyday folks about the mystery of life, broadcasting since 2014. I'm your host, Carmen Spaniola, joining you from the lands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Songhees, and the Esquimalt First Nations, recently known as Victoria, BC, Canada. I am delighted to welcome to the show someone I really admire and appreciate, clinical counselor and fat activist Dawn Serra. Dawn offers trauma-informed, weight-neutral, radical mental health care, particularly for those in larger and marginalized bodies. We've been in each other's orbit since 2016 at least, initially online in Facebook groups. But also, Dawn and her husband have house sat for me, for up to a month at a time while I've led wilderness quests. So she's taking care of my pets, sat at my table, slept in my bed, but we've never actually met in person, which is kind of wild because you do start to just kind of feel like you know a person pretty well. And then you stand back and it's like, oh, I haven't actually literally stood beside you before. It's sort of an unusual intimacy to have without ever having been in someone's presence. But anyway, I guess that's why it was so easy to slide right into this conversation today about fatphobia, anti-Blackness, ableism, disability, perimenopause, Ozempic, and cultivating a kinder relationship with our ever-changing bodies. So, Dawn, what identities do you lead with?
I lead with white, cis, queer, super fat, disabled, and settler. Those are kind of like the leaders. And then of course there's others, but I feel like that's what captures kind of the things people see and how I move through the world most of the time.
So we've known each other for a while. I feel like it's only recently that I've heard you identify as super fat, just because we've been in space together more recently. And I was like, oh, something has kind of shifted from when we first met. So how does one come to identify as super fat as opposed to just fat, or a different phrase like living in a bigger body?
Yeah. So for me, I have always been in a body that was bigger than my peers. Looking back at myself in my teen years, I was not fat. However, I was bigger than my peers, and so I was the fat one, you know? I didn't really move into plus sizes until probably around college. But for me, most of my teens and 20s were really about doing everything I could to not be fat. That was a big part of my identity. And in my early 30s, I started finding fat activism, and that started shifting my relationship with my body. And it took me a couple of years of being in that space before I started trying on the language of fatness. It still felt a little tender and charged. Culturally, fat is a very bad thing to be. There's a lot of morality around it. So it took me a while to arrive at fat. And fat felt really good. But through the pandemic and with perimenopause, my body got bigger. And I realized that how I was interacting with the world and how the world around me was disabling me, I really needed to kind of consider how I was taking up space and how oppression was impacting me. And within fat community, there are some loose markers that help people kind of understand the hierarchy of fatness. That to, be on the smaller end of plus sizes means you can probably still shop XXL in Targets and, mainstream stores. And then, Roxane Gay uses the phrase Lane Bryant fat, folks who can really only find clothes in plus size clothing stores. But people who are on the higher end of the weight spectrum in the fat community who are sized out of plus size stores exist. And they were really feeling invisibilized and like they wanted something that helped to identify them as being the most marginalized, the people who experience the most violence. And so fat community back in 2008, a group named No Lose came up with the phrase super fat. And since then, additional kind of massaging of the language has happened. And so now folks who are kind of getting sized out of plus size stores are super fat. And then even beyond that is infinifat. People for whom clothes just don't even exist at all. Everything has to be custom made. And, as my body grew, I realized I had shifted into this super fat category of sometimes being able to find clothes that fit and were comfortable in plus size stores, but often needing to go even into sizes bigger than that. And it has also really shifted my experience of spaces to be in a body that's moved into that size category. So claiming super fat for me helps me to, one, be able to like validate my own experience. I don't need to gaslight myself out of the experiences of really not being able to fit in spaces, despite the fact that fat bodies have always existed. And it helps to offer a sense of conversation and people ask questions. And also just within fat community, it helps people to kind of place, where is my privilege within access and fatness?
Thank you so much for receiving that question and clarifying. So let's go deeper into fat phobia, and I want you to just give it to me straight. What does it imply about my own internalized fat phobia, or internalized, I guess, meaning I'm trying to suppress it, but also maybe it's not internalized. It's just fat phobia. I am aware that I feel uncomfortable referring to someone as fat because of what you said. I grew up in a household. I was just telling someone today about how I remember there was a 2-week period. There was my great grandma, my grandma, my mom, my 3 aunties, and me. I would have been like 5 years old. And we had this huge pile of grapefruit. And that's all anybody was eating. It was 1980 or something. It was all they ate for 2 weeks. So just that relentlessly invalidating environment with anything to do with fatness is very alive in me, for sure. So what does it say about me that's uncomfortable? Like, I don't know that I would be comfortable calling someone fat, even if they called themselves that.
Well, that last piece you just named for me is the really important kind of decision point. First, is it language someone claims for themselves openly? I would not refer to somebody else's fat unless they have claimed that language for themselves. And maybe we've even had a conversation, because we do live in a culture that enacts violence against fatness. And a lot of people who are in bigger bodies are still actively doing everything they can to just not be in a bigger body because it's unbearable the way that you're treated in the world. And so for me, calling somebody else fat, there implies a certain level of intimacy and familiarity. They call themselves that. And that's a part of their identity that they very consciously claimed. Otherwise, if I was referring to somebody else's body, I'd probably say bigger body or on the higher end of the weight spectrum, and not use that language that's so charged for so many of us. Because even people that are in, what I would label as fat bodies may not feel comfortable using the language of fatness. But I think that discomfort highlights something that's so real. There's a lot of social capital and belonging that happens at a cultural level, particularly for women and for feminized folks, around the quest to not be bigger, the quest for smallness, diet talk in the office and those kinds of things. And so, fatness is a really scary thing for most people because we see what happens to fat folks. And we don't want that to happen to us. And so it's rightfully a charged word. And that's part of why fat community is using it to help kind of take some of that edge off. This is a descriptor for a body bodies come in ranges of sizes and colors and shapes and abilities and weights. And fat has become a violent word. But what if it's just a descriptor that some bodies are bigger and some bodies are smaller? So I think the fact that it's charged for you is simply really indicative of the culture we live in that's taught you to be fat is dangerous. There is actual loss, actual violence to move through the world in a bigger body.
Okay, what's the difference then between health at every size, which is something that I've, been aware of for some time, feel very attracted to when it comes to like, who would I want to work with as a personal trainer, or like whose fitness classes am I going? There's no fucking way I'm going to somebody who isn't a health at every size advocate, for instance. What's the difference between that and say body positivity and body neutrality?
Mm-hmm. So body positivity originally kind of emerged as something that was really being claimed by folks in bigger bodies, fat bodies, and got co-opted, as most things do in our culture, by corporations and by people who were maybe not in fat bodies, but were a little bit bigger than their peers and, realized they could build a whole brand off of that. So body positivity has lost a lot of its activism, a lot of its roots, and now often has a flag of kind of like, love yourself no matter what. And it often comes with a, you should love yourself first mentality that people are starting to question. And body neutrality kind of came on the scene and said, what if we don't have to love our body or hate our body? What if our body just got to be a body? What if it was just a way we experienced life, what allowed us to have pleasurable experiences and to tune into our emotions and didn't have any kind of good or bad morality measure to it? So those are kind of like ways of conceptualizing of bodies and how we feel about them. Health at every size is a specific movement that emerged in response to diet culture. And really what health at every size currently stands for, it's changed over the years and is changing again right now. But what it essentially flags is if somebody says they're health at every size, typically it means they have done some level of investigation and questioning of their own biases around what health means, who gets to be healthy, and they're working to separate the narrative that fat inherently is unhealthy, and rather that bodies can have all kinds of different health regardless of weight. We all know people who struggle to walk or who experience chronic pain or who have heart disease who are in smaller bodies. So it's not a direct, line, fat equals you are unhealthy, which at a cultural level is very normalized. And so health at every size basically says, regardless of the size you're at, we get to ask questions about what kind of health is available to you. How would you like to be moving through your life? What feels like it could be changed? What don't you want to touch? But we're not going to come at it from a perspective of weight loss is how we get you there. And so it's helpful, like you said, to work with a personal trainer, to work with a dietitian, to work with a therapist who's health at every size informed, will help flag that they've probably done some work around internalized weight biases. Also, as it gains in popularity, more and more people are claiming that without having actually done a lot of the work to challenge those biases. So it's a start, but certainly I encourage people to ask hard questions of anybody who's claiming that label. But it is at least an opportunity to say, oh, this person has at least thought about it. And now we can have a different conversation. My body won't be problematized just because of the size I'm showing up in.
And there is training available. You could go to, you literally just Google health at every size and you will see there's institutes and courses and things like that.
Yeah.
You talked about how at perimenopause there was this like I mean, perimenopause can be a dramatic change for at least half of us. It's going to be like, what the fuck? We've talked about it a lot on this
Definitely.
podcast, but this whole thing of shifting baselines with how I am in relationship with my body, it's definitely come up where it's like, oh, wow, the amount of weight that I have gained extremely quickly and extremely isolated at my belly has
Mhm.
really challenged me to like walk my talk with, oh, I'm just going to love myself. Right.
Yep.
And so, and like you say, I'll look back, that like I guess it was last year where I went up. I don't know what the sizes are, but like
Mhm.
I couldn't fit two more sizes up at least.
Mm.
So quite
Mhm.
rapid. And
Mhm.
now when I look back at photos, I'm like, oh my God, you were so skinny penny and spent all
Mhm.
that time hating your belly,
Yep.
like what
Yep.
the hell? So it's very clear. It doesn't matter what size I am. That part I
Yeah.
get in my mind.
Yeah.
But tell me about your experience of actually unpacking these biases and actually, confronting the part of you that you can't just decide, oh, I'm just going to love it. It
Right.
like doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel like me.
Mhm.
Something has happened
Mhm.
that I wasn't prepared for.
Yes. The wasn't prepared for really resonates. There is absolutely, I think so much of what I have grieved around the perimenopause journey for myself is just around the time that the very earliest symptoms of perimenopause, which I did not know at the time, were coming in. I was starting to feel like, okay, like maybe body could be home. Maybe after 3 decades of being at war with you, I'm finally starting to soften around the places where I've constricted. Maybe I can think with more kindness. Maybe I understand how you move. And just as that was finally like an exhale happening for me, perimenopause started coming in, and all of a sudden my body felt foreign. Things smelled different and hurt different, and the places where I held weight changed, which changed like my center of gravity. I put on weight. It was just like all of these things started happening, and body felt foreign again in a way that was surprising and unwelcome, just because I would really have loved to have had, maybe a couple of years, but a decade would have been nice of just like, oh, here I am.
Mm.
Here we are, in relationship. And I didn't get that. So the unexpectedness certainly, has been a grief process for me. Um, Also just some real disappointment that at a cultural level, it wasn't until I entered perimenopause and found the language that flagged to other people who were having the experience that we would then talk about it. And it took actually being in the muck to learn about this experience. Why didn't I spend my whole life preparing for this through elders and rituals? And so anyway, but my experience of my body now is one of change, one of grief, one of surprise. Disability really came in for me with chronic pain, a loss of certain kinds of mobility and movement. I have to walk with a cane on some days, which has really challenged a lot of my internalized ableism. And also, there's a difference that we have to name between being in a smaller body and using a mobility device, and what the world sees and thinks and how you get treated, versus being in a fat body and using a mobility device. We all know what people assume the problem is immediately
Mm.
on site, right? And so having to kind of really grapple with that, and even how the world's responding to me differently, simply because now sometimes I have this stick in my hand, is, really important. So, for me, this shift has really been one of grief, of feeling on unsteady ground. And I'm just starting to, after a couple of years, feel like, okay, we're kind of starting to understand each other. And I will say my experience and most of the people that I work with, because I specialize in supporting people in bigger bodies from a mental health perspective, um, even when you do the work of like fat activism, you embrace a fat liberatory ethic, you work every day to really root out the bias, to ask yourself hard questions, to confront the stories, there's almost always some small voice that's like, but maybe if I could just lose the weight, then, and it's usually a very, like simplified, fictionalized point A to point B kind of story, but it's seductive because that's what we're promised by all of these mega corporations who just want our money. But, that's really, some part of me that'll kind of be like, well, maybe I should try, maybe I should do this. And I try to just have so much compassion, like, of course I have that little voice. Of course, there's that part of me that wants to believe that wants things to be easier, that, longs for the, fictionalized story. It would all just be easier if. And so it's also just been a real practice of allowing that part of me to exist and then holding it with just such tender compassion rather than ridiculing it or criticizing it or trying to get rid of it. But it's an ongoing everyday process.
Thank you for sharing that. What I'm thinking about now is like the ACE studies and how, like, so Vincent Felitti, for folks who don't know, worked for Kaiser Permanente, had one of the biggest studies on weight back in the 70s and 80s. And they were trying to look for exactly that evidence of like, if we could just help people lose weight, then our insurance coverage, that would help all these other things. And of course, Vincent Felitti's life was kind of set on a whole different path when he kind of realized like, oh, it's the trauma. It's that people in bigger bodies or the higher end of the weight spectrum also had higher ACE scores. So I'll put a link to that and some great videos with him for folks who are interested. But I know that even today, if you don't really understand the context of that and how that data shaped Vincent Felitti's work, there could be a real like arm's length, like I do not enjoy the history of ACE studies. But it is just kind of like, here's the data. If you are in a bigger body, you will have more traumatic things that happen to you. And so the real question is the chicken and the egg, right? It's not about weight and health. It's about the trauma. And which came first? Is it the trauma of being in the bigger body that makes you more at risk? Or did something happen that created a neurobiological shaping that created a bigger body? We don't totally know, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, because you've said already that there's the trauma of living in the bigger body, and also fat people are more traumatized by society.
Yeah. There is a much, well, I hesitate to draw parallels, but to step outside of your door as a Black or an Indigenous person is to know you're stepping into a world that is likely to commit violence against you. Same with disabled folks. It is a conscious effort to leave your house as a disabled person, knowing you're probably going to be met with endless barriers and microaggressions. And the same is true for folks that are in fat bodies, that to leave my home is to open myself up to microaggressions and violence. And like so many people who experience ongoing harm, the very places we turn to for care are often the places of the greatest violence. Medical establishments, healthcare, mental health, those kinds of places. And, there's a really important resistance inside of fat community to call it trauma, because that's been something that's been held over us for so long. If you resolve the trauma, your weight will fall off. I can't tell you how many books I read, in my early 20s that were like romance novels. And the story was she was fat and he loved her anyway. And then once she felt loved, the weight just fell off magically and then she was skinny.
Mm.
And so there's a real fear, and rightly so, that the fatness is blamed on a thing.
Mm.
I think that it's far more complicated than any single answer or narrative. I think for some people, trauma happens and the response at a biological level is in some way tied to weight gain. I think other people have certain kinds of experiences and it leads to weight loss. I also have heard people say just the most beautiful things. The fat therapist, Sonali Rishatwar, has talked about how they see their body as this heirloom of the survivors,
Mm.
that it was the fat ancestors of their brown, I think South Asian background, they survived the British colonial violence. They survived all the hard things. So this body is an heirloom of those who survived like intergenerational trauma. So it's not a problem to be solved. It's something to be revered.
Mm.
And I think it's also important, that the medicalization of fat is very recent. It's really just within like the last 100 years that fat has been seen as a medical or a health issue. It's been moralized since around the 1600s, and that's tied very much to the enslavement of Africans and race. But, we have art that they've unearthed from 8,000 BCE and beyond, these beautiful marble figurines that were clearly used for some type of important ritual. And they're all fat figures with big apron bellies and really fat thighs. So what that helps to show us is that bodies have always existed on a spectrum. They've always come in a range of sizes and weights, and how we feel about that is very much tied to systems of oppression and hierarchy. So I do think that to move through the world in a fat body, especially in certain cultures more than others, and class absolutely has, something to do with that too, is to experience more or less trauma because of who you're around, the systems you're moving inside of. And so, yes, trauma is happening to me constantly for being in a fat body. Trauma also happens to us, and then our bodies change. Is it because of the trauma? Is it because of hormones? Is it because genetics? We don't know. But I think what I would offer is for anyone who wants to try and make a really simple this to that, it's far more complex than that because our bodies are just too diverse and carry too many legacies for us to be able to simply say, you had trauma, that's why you're fat. Resolve the trauma, it goes away.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, you mentioned the medicalization of weight, of fatness. What do you think about Ozempic? I don't know if this is just my TikTok because I have like crutches and spice and also a lot of
Oh, Mhm.
like I don't know what you would call it, like culture work, people who are interrogating culture.
Mhm.
And so Ozempic is a thing.
Yeah.
Ozempic face is a term, those kinds of things.
Mm.
So do you think this medicalized weight loss can be liberatory, or is it just putting people through another kind of hell to pursue this mythic norm?
Yeah. I think a couple of things. One, I will never blame a person in a bigger body for wanting to not be in the bigger body. Because if there is a path from the violence of oppression to no longer experiencing that oppression or experiencing less of it, of course, it makes sense to me that the oppressed would want to move in that direction. So for me, the problem is less about folks who are deciding whether or not to engage in that. I support bodily autonomy. I want people to have all the information so that they can choose best for themselves. And some people will choose something different than I would. That said, I don't think that it's liberatory because most of the information that's out there is very incomplete. There is a wonderful activist named the Fat Doctor. Their name is Asher Larmy. They're out of the UK, and they have a fantastic masterclass on Ozempic and the semaglutide class of drugs that I highly recommend to folks if they're interested in this. But the short hand of basically what they found is because they're trained as a medical doctor, they've done very deep dives into all the clinical trials and the studies that have come from those. And a lot of people might experience heartbreak hearing this, but whether you're engaging in kind of like a traditional diet or you're taking one of these weight loss drugs, the arc of what happens to your body is almost identical, which is an initial weight loss, a plateau, and then a weight regain. And what they're finding is even in the clinical trials, around week 68, folks were at their lowest weight, and immediately the weight started creeping back on, and it never stopped. And that's while taking the drug. Now, if you stop taking the drug, they did this in the step 5 of the trials. 20 weeks in, they had the placebos and the semaglutide folks switch. And the people who were taking the semaglutide at week 20 switched over to the placebo, and the weight didn't just come on, it came on alarmingly fast, like to the point where it caused significant stress to the body. Our bodies are not meant to weight cycle. That's what causes major cardiovascular strain, is the weight cycling more than just a kind of steady weight gain. But anyway, the drugs are promising something that is very financially lucrative and that also helps to contribute to the medical industrial complex's drive to eradicate all fatness. The actual impact to bodies, though, is understudied. And so far, most of the studies, when they get to the very tail end of them, the weight's coming back on. And there's so many people who are going to think that it's because they've failed in some way. And it's not that. It's that bodies don't like weight loss. It seems like death, starvation, and our bodies will do anything they can to not starve to death, including putting on more weight in case you try again.
Yeah. Right.
And so this kind of rebounding doesn't really get discussed because it's not profitable. So is it liberatory? I would not say that it is. However, I want to support bodily autonomy and people doing the very best that they can with the information they have. And then we work with the feelings that come up, whatever comes next.
Okay, I hesitate to bring her up but I feel like this is a perfect, she's an avatar for what I want to talk about. So it seems like all roads of oppression lead to anti-Blackness, and fat phobia is no different. And I just recently saw another public intellectual that I appreciate so much, Trisha Cottom. I'm missing a name there. Anyway, she was on Oprah's big event, and I feel like it was a weight loss thing. I don't really know the context, but I was like, oh wow, this is one of my favorite public intellectuals. All of these will be linked on the Oprah show, talking about, I remember it when Oprah came on stage with her little Red Ryder wagon in her tiny little jeans, and just like, oh, when we think about anti-Blackness and weight, and we think of that from the slave trade to Oprah on stage, please give us a context here for the relationship between fat phobia and anti-Blackness.
Yeah. So Sabrina Strings wrote Fearing the Black Body, and the entire book is a really deep dive into essentially from like the 1300s to now, and the emergence of how anti-fatness is because of colonial violence and anti-Blackness. So I highly recommend folks check out that book. Deshaun Harrison has also written about anti-fatness and anti-Blackness in Belly of the Beast. And Gloria Lucas from Nalgana Positivity Pride does a lot of beautiful workshops around the anti-colonialism that's tied to anti-fatness. And so all of those scholars are the folks that I'm learning from, and those activists. So they can certainly speak to this way better than I can as a white person. However, I think, taking what they're sharing with us and sharing it here will hopefully help stoke curiosity so that people go seek out those resources and, pay them for their time. we know when we look at, from like a European perspective, as we exist here on, what is called North America in Canada, that we are heavily influenced by, European culture, a culture of colonization. And so when we look back at kind of dominant white culture, we know that there was a time in high Renaissance where voluptuous bodies, rounded tummies, thick thighs were very wanted. And that started changing in the early Enlightenment, when the upper class elite intellectual men started claiming that thinness was a sign of male rationality. So we're starting to see some things around bodies, men wanting to say, the superior of us men are thin. And then that got layered on top of with the enslavement of Africans and the trade of, these human beings, and Blackness starting to show up in Europe and in the colonized Americas, that early race scientists were trying to find evidence that white folks were superior. And one of the things that they started kind of clinging on to was around body size. And they started kind of drawing these lines that to be fat was to be similar to these Africans who were less human, less worthy of humanity than the white Europeans. And then there's so many layers of this that continued, but initially thinness was seen as sickness. And we can see that in like art and, how people are portrayed, that for a long time to be very skinny was evidence of illness. And then it started to shift as the enslavement trade started really picking up, as colonizers went over to the Americas and started seeing indigenous peoples and wanting to find ways to separate themselves from the people who would ultimately become the providers of all the physical labor. And that's where we start seeing, especially around femininity, a big shift, that white women are small and frail, and that Black women are simultaneously excessive and inferior. They are too much. There's a monstrosity to the bigness. And then that really got picked up by women's magazines in the early 1900s. And that pushed even more that white women were the peak of a femininity and that they should always be questing for thinness. And then the medical industrial complex got involved and really moralized it. And Gloria Lucas also talks about how, like the colonizers who came over to the Americas were horrified by the diets of the indigenous peoples because they ate a lot of food that came from the land. And upper crust wealthy folks saw that food that came from the dirt must make you dirty. And we want to be different from these folks who are dark skinned and who we see as uncivilized and savage. And that's where the "you are what you eat" kind of mentality and phrasing really started coming from. That if you're eating from the ground, you must be dirty, you must be savage, you must be like the brown folks were colonizing. And if you're eating food that comes from birds, that comes from trees, that comes from bushes, those kinds of things, you're eating clean. We also can then see very direct lines to like the clean eating movement that's been popular the past couple of decades. So anyway, through all of these kind of like unfolding layers of how do we construct whiteness as the peak human experience, fatness, morality, intellectualizing, all of those things got tied together. And it also ties in really importantly with like purity culture and Christianity. So Gloria Lucas talks about how diet culture is the 3 Ps. It's the purity, perfectionism, and punishment. And immediately we go, of course, when we think about a diet, it's about eating the good foods, doing it perfectly all the time, and being punished when you stop. And so it's a very complex place, but it definitely has very clear, deep ties to colonial violence and anti-Blackness and enslavement of Africans.
Mm. Fascinating and diabolical.
Absolutely.
Again, we'll put all these links in the show notes so you can dive deeper into the works of all those folks that you cited there, Dawn. I want to come back around to medicalization and also the disabling that the world imposes on people in bigger bodies. You have an essay in a book called The Care We Dream Of, Liberatory and Transformative Approaches to LGBTQ plus Health, and that's by Zena Sharman. Can you talk to us about the intersections between fat phobia and ableism and how you arrived, given what you've experienced, how did you arrive at your essay in that book, which is around the possibility of healthcare to be a pleasurable experience?
For me, I've done so much learning from disabled advocates and the disability justice movement. And one of the things that I've learned from so many of these disabled activists is that the problem is never their body. It's that they aren't giving the tools or the thought to get to participate in the world in the ways that they can. One essay from Mia Mingus that I want to say was in Adrienne Marie Brown's anthology called Octavia's Brood, which is a collection of short stories that are speculative fiction. I think that's where the essay was. But Mia Mingus wrote this beautiful short story fiction about a world that had colonized another planet and they shipped all of their disabled people to this planet. Let's just get rid of disability on Earth. We don't want disabled folks here. And so when a child was born, if they were disabled or if someone became disabled, you put them in a rocket ship and send them off to this planet. We don't care what happens. They're just not here. But what happened on that planet was all of these disabled people started using their creativity and their technology to make things accessible for everyone, regardless of what the need was. And they had created this beautiful, cobbled together society where, regardless of what the disability was, all of these people used their wonderful, creative, disabled minds to find a way to make things accessible. And it was such a beautiful image of what's possible. We can literally replace hearts. We can fly to other planets. It is not beyond human capacity to make things accessible for people who have bodies that work differently. But because of ableism and because ableism is so deeply tied to capitalism and productivity, we see disabled bodies as inconvenient or as an afterthought rather than from where we start. And I heard Sonali Rishatwar and several other fat activists years ago talking about how fat bodies, because of how they're excluded from so many spaces, are often treated in a very similar way to disabled bodies, which is, we just didn't think about you. We didn't think about the fact that there's a stair here and you're in a motorized chair. We didn't think about the fact that literally fat bodies have always existed. We have art from 8,000 BCE, and yet we bought all of these chairs that have arms on them. So sorry if you can't fit in them. There's this real afterthought, and it's really about how the spaces are designed that disable us. So in many ways, to be in a fat body and to be in a disabled body is to be the body that's not thought of. I move into spaces every single day, and I have to be concerned if there will be a place for my body. Most of the time, if I want to eat on a patio with my friends, I can't sit in the same chair as them because almost all patio chairs have very narrow arms on them for whatever reason. And usually the restaurant has to pull a chair with no arms from inside out, and I'm in the different chair. Thankfully, I've arrived at a place in my life where I advocate for my comfort. But I spent years moving into spaces, and my question was, can I tolerate the pain long enough? That was the bar. Can I tolerate the pain long enough to stay here for this lunch? Can I tolerate the pain long enough, even if afterwards I get horrible diarrhea and I have a stomach ache and bruises for days? It got me to the place. That was the bar. And what a heartbreaking bar. What a heartbreaking thing that my pain was not only something that I didn't feel was important enough to name, but that the people in my life never thought to ask about. And that actually changed for me because Zena Sharman and I went to a literary event together years ago. And I went in being so nervous because it was at a university with theater seating. And I knew I probably wasn't going to be able to fit in the chair without some pretty serious pain. But Zena and I walked into the space and she immediately walked up to the organizer and said, "My friend's in a bigger body. Her comfort matters to me. What will you do so that she can be comfortable here?" No one had ever thought about my comfort before in that way. And that moment was like, wow, what if I let the people in my life know that that's actually an act of care that really matters to me? And that changed. I started naming that. And then people in my life started like calling ahead and asking. But I mean, I was 39, 40 years old. And that was the first time anybody had ever said, "These seats look like they might not be comfortable for you and your comfort matters." And I also want to name, for people who are maybe listening and they're in a different place with their body, there is a time in my life when if someone who cared about me had done that publicly, I would have died from shame and left. To be named out loud as being so big that the chairs might not fit me, I had so much internalized hatred of the size of my body that if someone had done that, I would not have been able to stay in that. It would have been absolutely shameful. So I say that just because I don't want folks to just start doing that for the people in their lives. Have a conversation about it first. Because some people feel a lot of shame around having the size of their body discussed out loud in front of others, again, because we get teased or, bullies. When I move into medical spaces, most of the time the equipment does not work for me. My doctor ordered a 24-hour blood pressure halter for me through Life Labs a couple years ago. And I was nervous already about it just because I don't know, like what if the results are bad? So far in my life, my blood pressure has been great, but what if this is the time that it's not? And I show up at the Life Labs nervous and they didn't have a blood pressure cuff that fit my arm. And the nurse tried and tried and tried, and she was embarrassed that it didn't fit and got flustered. And then I got embarrassed that she was embarrassed. And I ended up walking out without the medical device that I needed. And what they said was, "You'll have to go to a hospital, or they're the only ones in the area that carry big blood pressure cuffs, and hopefully they can help you." And I ended up never getting it. I had to buy a blood pressure machine myself and manually take all the measurements because Life Labs, the multi-million-dollar corporation that offers all of our care here in, the lower mainland, didn't have a device that fit. So I was talking with Zena, and she knew that I'd been doing a lot of work around pleasure. And she asked me to be a part of her book if we could be in conversation about radically reimagining healthcare. For me, healthcare has never been a safe place. I've been lucky and that I have had one or two doctors who treated me like a human being and who didn't lead with the size of my body. That breaks my heart. Not only that it's been so few, but that I know so many people who haven't even had one. And I want us to dream into things that are more than just the bare minimum. Like I don't want us to be grateful for people who are in relationships with cis men. I don't want the bar to be, he just doesn't beat me, or he doesn't make me do all the emotional labor. Why is that the bar? We want something that's like changing us for the better, that's lifting us up, that's making us want to be the biggest and best versions of ourselves. And when it comes to healthcare, that is not what most of us experience, especially like queer, trans, BIPOC, disabled, fat folks. And so Zena and I entered into this conversation around what if the places where we go for care were actually places where the bare minimum was pleasure, the bare minimum. That's not where we are. Where we are is how do we maybe get rid of most of your pain, and that's good enough. But I don't want the absence of pain to be where we start. I want pleasure to be where we start. And so we started talking about what would need to change in the spaces, in the waiting rooms, in the questions we asked, in the training that was offered, in the experience from when we walked in or called on the phone to when we walked out of our surgery or appointment. What if it was a pleasurable experience? How different for our nervous systems, for our mental health, for our relationships, care would be if pleasure was the baseline. And that's really what that conversation came down to, was what if pleasure was the baseline? It's a whole different framework for care than can we just fix the broken stuff? And I mean, if you can get some good stuff, not our department.
Right. What is the most important thing you've learned about experiencing pleasure in your body, given the journey that you've been on? And as you said, you work with pleasure quite a bit. Like, what's the most important thing you've learned about facilitating that experience? And like, what can you share with others about how can we get some of that? Is it a phrase? Is it a practice? What is it?
For me, pleasure is essential, especially as a mental health provider. The temptation is to go towards the pain, but at what expense? What if we thickened for people their access to pleasure and joy and aliveness? So many of the things we suffer would naturally begin to relax, resolve, or just simply feel less alone inside if we realize there is opportunity for pleasure and joy and the things that bring us alive. So how do we orient towards those things rather than orienting towards the pain? So that's the first thing I'll say. The second thing I'll say is I have learned through the work of people like Betty Martin and a number of other like sexuality experts and body-based experts, somatic experts, that there's kind of what I call the 3 pillars of pleasure. And I teach this in workshops to healthcare professionals all the time as a way to kind of like, when we really peel it back, what's necessary for pleasure to be possible? And there's kind of 3 things. The first is that pleasure only ever happens in the now. So you have to be present. Pleasure doesn't happen in the past, because even when we think about something pleasurable that happened in the past, we're experiencing it in the body now. And when we dream about what's to come, that's going to be that delicious meal we're having next week, we're salivating now. So pleasure only ever happens in the present moment, which means we need to be able to arrive in our experience in the present moment, even if it's just a few seconds. It's not that kind of, call to embodiment that was so popular so many years ago. It's not about staying in the body and trying to force ourselves to be here, but can I drop in for a few seconds and then leave if I need to? But it has to be now. The second pillar is that context matters. A light hand on my low back in my home from my partner is very different than a light hand on my low back in a crowded bus surrounded by people I don't know. Safety from a nervous system perspective has to come first. We have to be safe enough that we're not in collapse or freeze or fight and flight. So what's the context we're moving in? If we're in an abusive situation, pleasure is going to be pretty hard to access, and rightly so from a survival perspective. But we really have to think about context. And I want to also say something that's super important, because I work with this all the time. So many of my clients are women who are in relationships where there is this sometimes not so subtle, but often subtle expectation of sex that creates pressure. And that is not safe for our nervous system. If my no isn't going to be met with warmth and acceptance, sure, they can be disappointed, but like, thank you so much for saying no. It's safe to say that here. Why would we expect sex to be a thing that we want? You know, and it's same when it comes to food. If the people around us are judging what's on our plate, why am I expecting to be able to enjoy this meal? So context matters, safety matters. And then the third pillar is that pleasure always happens through our senses. So if we can just start gently turning towards our senses and where our yes is, pleasure becomes so much more possible. What are the smells you love? What are the temperatures that feel like a yes? What are the foods that when you eat them, you're like, oh, God? What are the sounds, the music, the voices, the moans that just like really bring something alive in you? So if we can arrive in the present moment in a safe enough context where we really feel like our yes and no is welcome, and we tune into our senses, pleasure's right there waiting. And it can be really simple, small moments. And that's another thing that I invite people to do is if we can cultivate dozens of small moments over a day where pleasure emerges versus waiting for the weekend, waiting for vacation, a life on hold, we're so much more likely to start experiencing pleasure and joy in our day-to-day lives, which is where the good stuff is anyway.
Thank you for sharing all that. I want to highlight for folks who kind of perked up when you said that subtle or not so subtle expectation for sex feels like pressure. We did a whole rant on that on the episode with Amelia Symington Fetty, What It Feels Like for a Girl, talking about her book Skid Dogs and our journeys in that of just like really finding our no and having that be a-okay, fully welcomed, totally, no no then additional emotional labor around having to like manage the mood of the gloomy roomie who is like, yeah, it's fine, but actually
And then pouts for 3
like,
days. Yeah.
exactly. Right. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
thank you for circling, lifting that up for us. Do you talk to yourself, Dawn? Like, because I feel like a lot of it is a bit of a head game too, like there's being in your senses, being in the now. These are all very useful. I don't want to diminish those, but do you have like, I think I had a really big breakthrough after I had my child, and it just hit me so hard. I don't want my child to hate their body. I don't want my child to be ashamed. I don't want my child to feel inferior. And so I just kind of did the fake it till you make it, like, well, I'm just never going to say anything bad about my body again, like outwardly or inwardly. And I just kind of flicked a switch in my brain. I don't know. This is maybe the advantage of being a more avoidant attacher by nature. You can compartmentalize really well. But now that I've earned a lot of secure attachment, I'm much more of a feeler. I do feel myself in my clothes. I feel the changes with perimenopause. I feel different. And the head game, I don't have that sort of external motivation so much anymore. And I think most of the time I'm okay. I'm just like, feels like my civic duty as a feminist to just like shut up about my body already, But do you talk to yourself a certain way? Do you have a way? Please share.
Yes. Yeah. There are certain places where pleasure is a lot easier and less charged for me. That's probably true for most people. So when people are new in cultivating like their pleasure awareness, their pleasure journey, start where it's easy and less charged. For a lot of people, food, body, those kinds of things are going to be really charged. So maybe it's with music, sounds of nature, textures of blankets and socks, those kinds of things that feel like I can be here and it doesn't bring up all the inner critic stuff. For the places where it's a little more charged, like you mentioned, if you put clothes on that used to fit and they don't anymore, or they fit different, or whatever it is, um, maybe you become allergic to a food you used to love. There's going to be parts of us that want to make meaning about that have judgments. And it makes sense because for me, how I conceptualize of that is that these parts of me that have feelings about that are really concerned with belonging. They're concerned with safety. Oh no, if you've gotten bigger, what if life's even harder? Maybe we should do something about that. And so it does take practice, but what I try to do is those parts of me, those voices, that inner critic, it's going to come in lightning fast. Often I can't get ahead of it because I don't know a thing fits different till it's on my body and then the judgment's started. So it's more about as early as possible in the process. Sometimes I get hooked for hours or days, but it's much better now. But as early in the process as I can, if I notice I'm not being very nice to myself, I've been thinking about my body a whole lot. Have I been looking at Ozempic ads or thinking about what's in my fridge? Those are all cues that some part of me is afraid. And so how I speak to myself is to really turn towards that part of me. And do I either need to set boundaries with it in a really loving way, or do I need to kind of say, like, I get it. Of course, it makes sense. And here's what I know is true. That actually won't help me. That'll make things worse. But it makes sense why that's true. So it's a real practice of turning towards and then holding that fear, that concern is there for a really good reason, rather than I shouldn't think that about myself. I should be past this. I should be in a different place. That's just really going to cause way more pain inside my internal world, more rigidity. And what I want is more softness. Mm. And for some people, getting help from a counselor or from a community like Numinous Network might be a place where that helps to create a little more opportunity for some of that softness. Certainly being around people who have similar lived experiences is really helpful. I found a lot more self-compassion when I started surrounding myself with people who understood what it was like to move through the world in a body similar to mine. But it's not about getting rid of that. I don't think that that's possible, but it is about, hopefully I can develop a practice of inner trust that when it comes up, there's a reason. Those reasons matter. And I don't have to take action based on what they're telling me. I can just tend to the hurt.
What does a boundary sound like? When you say, I said
yeah.
to boundaries gently as I can, please tell me. I don't know about gentle boundaries.
Well, a really good one is, I'm neurodivergent, and I know a lot of people who listen are too. So one of the things I do is a lot of like echolalia. Like I will get the same phrase or the same piece of a song and it'll go for like weeks in my head. And so I've reached a place where if it's gone on to the point where I'm like, oh, I'm sick of that, I'll turn towards that little part of me and send it to a karaoke room that's soundproof. And so for me, that's like an inner boundary of like, if you want to keep shouting it at the top of your lungs, there's this beautiful little comfy karaoke booth. Why don't you go in there, sing your heart out? But we're going to close that soundproof door. And believe it or not, that little mental image and invitation to that part, like go sing your heart out, but over there, actually often shifts it for me. That'll stop doing it. So when it comes to like body stuff, there's places and times in my life where I can slow down and be with myself. And there's other times where I don't have that luxury. A great example is if I'm in the middle of a counseling session with a client, that's not the time for me to turn inside and spend some time with myself. My time needs to be on my client and holding that container. So that might be a place where if something comes up in me, I can go like, oop, that hit a nerve. That deserves some attention. And can you just go sit in the corner until I'm done? And then when I'm done, I actually do have to check in with myself. I'm not going to say that and never circle back. But, I try to adopt this very like relational way of dealing with those parts of me, just like I would the people in my life. Like, hey, I can't talk to you right now. I'm in a client session, but I'll connect with you as soon as I'm done. So for me, that's kind of what an inner boundary might sound like.
very parts therapy or internal family systems vibe.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
love it.
totally.
So, Dawn, the last question is always the same. How do you personally cope with grief and rage?
Mm, yeah. Interestingly, as I've deepened into my pleasure practice, I've learned that to deepen into a pleasure practice is to deepen into a grief practice. The more you feel, the more you feel. All the times I didn't advocate for myself, when that comes into awareness around how important that is, grief wells up. All the times I abandoned myself, all the times I'm like, oh, I now figured out what my yes is. How did I go this long without knowing that? Grief. So a lot of my grief practices these days are around either sharing in trusted spaces where my grief just gets to be true, having those internal dialogues with myself, connecting with nature, letting myself just feel really sad and heartbroken sometimes. It's not a thing I want to avoid. I want to actually like be with it and let it take up space without getting invested and like needing to stay there. But I find that just simply being in relationship with others is a grief practice in its own way. And so being able to talk about it and being able to just let it be true is a big part of grief for me. I also am a big play person. So often I'll play games, video games, especially where part of the story is in really intense grief. And I get to be in a story where my heart's broken and I'm crying, but then I get to emerge out of it. And so there's kind of a ritual aspect to it. Rage, for me is very different. I really try to be in relationship with my anger in a way where it constantly feels believed and heard. So that helps me to avoid my anger becoming a thing that I weaponize against others because it's so desperate to be heard and so reactive. There's so much to be rageful around right now. The injustice, the genocide, the violence that we're seeing in multiple places around the world. Rage is important right now. So I don't ever want that to not be here, but I want to be cautious that my rage isn't going out at the people that I care about, that it's directed at systems, that it's directed at places. So for me, rage is also grief work, but also really connecting to the systems and being rageful at the violence of the systems and not the individuals in my life who maybe, trip over a disappointment and then my rage comes out sideways.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for all the wisdom and knowledge and honesty that you shared with us today, Dawn. I'm so glad we got to have this conversation. It's like a conversation that in a way, feel it feels so comfortable and familiar. It's almost like, haven't we had this conversation?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I'm so glad we got to share this with everyone. Thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited that we got to do this too.
Trust that we've got you covered, friends. There are a ton of links in the show notes found in your podcast player, or perhaps if your podcast app cuts them off, you'll find them at numinouspodcast.com. You'll also find a link to Dawn's website there, and it sounds like she is taking new clients and couples. And I noticed on her website that her practice is currently seeking associate counselors who specialize in the areas we've touched on today, and a few other areas we didn't talk about. So if you're working online in a solo practice, like how lucky would you be to connect with an amazing colleague like Dawn? Explore options as a potential client or colleague at Dawn Serra's website, tendandcultivate.com. I'm so exhilarated by this conversation, and I hope you will also check out the links to follow Dawn on Instagram and sign up for her newsletter. What a wonderful human. Okay, the listener shout out today is actually a listener and reader shout out. It's a combination entry from Jen Hamilton, who left a very honest 5-star review on Amazon. Jen titled it, "A Feast for the Soul." I am a longtime listener of Carmen's podcast and a member of her Numinous network. I am not, however, much of a cook, so I've had her book in my cart for ages, thinking that recipes would be wasted on me. Imagine my surprise and delight that when her long-avoided book arrived, I realized that it was not yet another pretty cookbook that would just gather dust on my shelf, but a breathtaking glimpse into Carmen's life, altars, and Wheel of the Year. Each section is more beautiful than the next. The photos are moody and evocative in all the right ways. Making up for lost time, I read it cover to cover and now plan to relish and savor each season as it comes. My soul is soothed just seeing the pictures of the foods and traditions of my ancestors, and maybe even inspired to try something and make it my own. Thank you, Carmen. No, thank you, Jen. I love the story you shared, and I bet there's a lot of resonance with a lot of listeners. So thank you for taking the time. Thanks for being here, being a listener, and being a member. You can leave me a voice note or written feedback for this episode at castfeedback.com/Numinous podcast. Okay, that's also linked in the show notes, but one more time, castfeedback.com/Numinous podcast. The Numinous podcast is a proud member of the People's Public Health Education Campaign. Did you know, my friends, that in April 2024, this year, the World Health Organization, along with 500 scientists, including doctors, physicists, engineers, and public health professionals, finally arrived at agreed-upon science and terminology, saying that SARS-CoV-2, so COVID, is an airborne disease. So in the same way that some diseases are waterborne or bloodborne, we now have broad consensus that COVID travels through the air and lingers in the air. And that's why it's important to wear a respirator quality mask, like an N95 or an N99, and to clean the air whenever you can. Ventilation, ventilation, ventilation. It's airborne, so it lingers. Now, a study in 2022 from the University of Bristol found that it took more than 20 minutes to reduce the infectivity of SARS-CoV-2 down to just 10%. So that's why you can get it in an empty elevator if there's poor ventilation, even if someone, just left in the last 10, 15 minutes who was infected. And if you would like to see the drawing of the infectivity likelihood in a full elevator, I've got that linked in the show notes too. But I'll give you the highlights. This is a highlight for me. For a 2-minute elevator ride, if you're close to the infected person, at the high end, you'll have inhaled over 1,100 virus copies. However, the researchers found that if you wear a mask, at the high end, you'll only have inhaled 155 virus copies. So significantly less, like 10% of the amount. So wear your masks and open the windows, my friends. Okay, last thing. When I look ahead to the astrology of August of this year, it's pretty crunchy, my friends. Said it before, I'll say it again. Like Mars is doing some challenging things in August. I think there's going to be a lot of stress, some flashpoints, conflict. It's going to be a climate change chaos summer. I think it would be a really good idea to develop some somatic skills for trauma processing to stay on top of this, right? That's what we focus on in the Numinous Network. Plus, the moral injury course starts in June, so that would be a great chance to become current. Start processing some of the aproximal moral injury. That's a term I just made up. It's not actually scientific, but this idea of moral injury it's high stakes, but you're not frontline, but you are processing something that is clear and present, even though it's happening at a distance. You know what I'm talking about. We're talking about the genocide in Palestine. This trauma needs to be processed. We've got to stay on top of it. It gets blocked and stuck in the body, and we start behaving more erratically as we get more and more worn out. So let's get a jump on processing some of this accumulated stress before we head into high summer, before we hit August, yeah? Come join us. get into a new rhythm of somatics classes where you gently discharge stress, gently release stuck and blocked trauma response. It's not talk therapy, but like body-based practices that are simple and effective. Come hang out with us. You can find out more about the Numinous Network at carmenspagnola.com. CarmenSpagnola. Until next time, take care.